A dying man stumbles through a mountain blizzard into an abandoned ranger cabin, and beneath its rotting floorboards discovers a secret worth $270 million that powerful men have killed to keep buried for over 40 years. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind screamed through the Colorado Rockies like something alive, something angry. Snow fell so thick it erased the world, turning towering pines into ghosts and the narrow mountain trails into white oblivion. The storm had arrived 3 hours earlier than the forecast predicted, swallowing the high country in a fury of ice and darkness that made even the animals flee for cover. And somewhere in that howling wilderness, a man was dying. Jacob Reed had been hiking these mountains for 6 years, ever since he left the service and couldn't stand the noise of civilization anymore. At 34, he knew every ridge, every valley, every shelter between Copper Peak and the abandoned fire tower 20 miles south. He could read weather patterns in the clouds, track deer through fresh snow, and start a fire in rain with nothing but flint and patience. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, the mountain had turned on him. His beard was caked with ice. His fingers had gone numb an hour ago. The pack on his back, usually light and familiar, now felt like it was filled with stones. Every step forward was a negotiation between his body and his will, and his body was losing. He'd been caught out in weather before, had weathered storms that would have killed softer men, but this was different. This storm had teeth. Jacob's mind drifted as he pushed through waist-deep snow. He thought of Daniel, his younger brother, the kid with the infectious laugh who always looked up to him, the kid who followed him into the army because Jacob made it sound like an adventure, the kid who came home in a flag-draped box while Jacob came home with scars nobody could see and guilt that never stopped whispering. 6 years later, that guilt still walked beside him on every trail, sat across from him at every campfire, reminded him with every sunrise that he was still here and Daniel wasn't. He stumbled, caught himself against a pine tree, the bark rough even through his gloves. His vision blurred. Hypothermia was setting in. He knew the signs. Confusion, exhaustion, the dangerous warmth that made you want to lie down and sleep forever. He couldn't stop. Stopping meant dying. And despite everything, despite the weight he carried and the ghosts that followed, some stubborn part of him refused to quit. Through the white curtain of snow, he saw it. A dark shape, angular, man-made. At first, he thought it was a hallucination, the kind the cold conjured to torment the dying. But as he staggered closer, it solidified. A cabin, small, stone and timber, built low to withstand mountain winters. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin grey line before being torn apart by the wind. Someone was home. Jacob dragged himself up the 3 wooden steps to the porch, his legs barely responding. He raised a fist and pounded on the heavy door. Once. Twice. The third time, his knuckles barely made contact before his arm fell to his side. He leaned against the doorframe, his cheek pressed against the cold wood, waiting for something, anything. The door opened so suddenly he nearly fell inside. "Jesus Christ!" a woman's voice said. Strong hands caught him before he hit the floor. Jacob tried to focus, tried to speak, but his tongue felt thick and useless. He was aware of being pulled inside, of blessed warmth hitting his face like a physical force, of the door slamming shut behind him and the howl of the wind suddenly muffled. "Can you hear me?" the voice asked. Female, urgent, controlled. "Hey, can you hear me?" Jacob managed a nod. His eyes focused slowly. The woman kneeling in front of him was maybe 30, maybe younger, hard to tell. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, sharp brown eyes that missed nothing, and the kind of face that suggested she didn't tolerate nonsense. She wore a ranger's uniform, the green and grey of the National Forest Service, and moved with the efficiency of someone used to emergencies. "We need to get you warm," she said. Not a question, a statement of fact. "Can you walk?" "Yeah," Jacob managed, his voice a rasp. She helped him to a chair near the stone fireplace where flames crackled and popped. throwing orange light across the small cabin. Jacob's hands shook violently as she began removing his ice-crusted gloves. Her touch was professional, impersonal, but not unkind. "Name's Maya," she said, working on the frozen laces of his boots. "Maya Chen. I'm the ranger for this sector. You picked a hell of a night to be out." "Jacob," he said. "Jacob Reed." "Well, Jacob, you're lucky you found this place. Another hour out there and we'd be having a very different conversation." She pulled off his boots and immediately began checking his feet for frostbite. "Toes wiggle?" He tested them. Pain shot through his feet, but they moved. "Yeah. Good. That's good." She stood and moved to a cabinet, pulling out thick wool blankets. "This storm came out of nowhere. I've been up here 3 years and never seen weather turn this fast." She wrapped the blankets around his shoulders. "You alone out there?" Jacob nodded, his teeth still chattering. Maya studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowed. "You military?" The question caught him off guard. "Was. Marines. 8 years. She nodded like that explained something. "Thought so. Something about the way you carried yourself, even half frozen." She moved to the small kitchen area and put a kettle on the stove. "I was Army. 2 tours. Got out 5 years ago." That explained the efficiency, the lack of panic, the way she'd assessed and acted without hesitation. Jacob pulled the blankets tighter around himself, feeling slowly returning to his extremities in painful waves. The cabin was smaller than it had seemed from outside, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, with rough timber walls and a ceiling low enough that Jacob would have to duck in places. A single window faced east, currently rattling in its frame as the storm battered the glass. There was a cot in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and the fireplace that was currently saving his life. Everything was neat, organized, purposeful. This was someone's home, not just a shelter. "How long have you been stationed here?" Jacob asked, his voice stronger now. "This posting, 6 months. Maya poured hot water into 2 mugs and brought them over. "But I've been with the Forest Service since I left the Army. Started in California, then Oregon, requested transfer here 2 years ago." "Why here?" Jacob accepted the mug gratefully. The steam alone was a blessing. "It's pretty remote." Maya sat in the chair opposite him, her own mug cradled in her hands. "That's exactly why. Got tired of people, I guess. Tired of noise and politics and all the other bullshit." She took a sip. "Mountains don't lie to you. They'll kill you if you're stupid, but at least they're honest about it." Jacob almost smiled. "I know exactly what you mean." They sat in silence for a moment, 2 veterans who understood each other without needing to explain. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and somewhere in that shared quiet, a little of the tension eased. But not all of it. Maya set down her mug. "So what were you doing out there, Jacob? Nobody hikes these trails in late October, especially not alone, and especially not with a storm forecast." "Storm wasn't supposed to hit until tomorrow night," Jacob said. "I was heading to the old fire tower. Got a cache there." "The tower's been abandoned for 15 years. "I know, that's why I use it." Maya's expression shifted, became more guarded. "You live out here? Full time?" Jacob nodded. 6 years now. Got a cabin about 12 miles southeast of here. Nothing fancy, just enough to get through winter." "Alone?" "Alone." She studied him again, and Jacob could see her making calculations, assessments. He was used to it. Most people couldn't understand why someone would choose this life, would voluntarily walk away from everything civilization offered. They assumed you were running from something. They were usually right. "You ever get lonely?" Maya asked quietly. Jacob looked into his mug. "Sometimes, but it's better than the alternative." "Which is?" "Being around people who don't understand why you can't sleep through the night. Why loud noises make you want to crawl out of your skin. Why you'd rather freeze on a mountain than sit in traffic or stand in line at a grocery store." He looked up at her. "You know what I'm talking about." Maya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yeah, I do." The moment stretched between them, heavy with things neither of them wanted to say out loud. Then the lights flickered, once, twice, and went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness broken only by the firelight. "Damn it," Maya muttered, standing quickly. "Generator must be acting up again. Been having trouble with it all week." "I can take a look," Jacob offered, already pushing the blankets aside. Used to work on engines all the time. Military vehicles, civilian trucks, pretty much anything with moving parts. Maya hesitated. "You sure? You just came in half dead." "I'm fine now, and if that generator dies completely, we're both going to have a long, cold night." He stood, testing his legs. They held. "Where is it?" "Out back in the equipment shed, but the storm—" "I've been in worse." Jacob pulled his coat back on, still damp, but better than nothing. "Got a flashlight?" Maya grabbed 2 heavy-duty flashlights from a shelf and handed him one. "There's a Parker by the door that might fit you better. And here." She pulled a tool belt from a hook. "Everything you should need." Jacob strapped on the belt and pulled on the Parker. It was too small across the shoulders, but warmer than his own jacket. Maya bundled up as well, pulling a thick coat over her ranger uniform. "I'm coming with you," she said before he could protest. "2 sets of hands are better than 1, and you don't know where anything is." They stepped out into the storm together. The cold hit like a wall. Even the short distance to the equipment shed, maybe 30 feet, felt like a mile. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls, turning the landscape into an alien world of white and shadow. Jacob's flashlight beam barely penetrated 10 feet before being swallowed by the swirling white. The shed was a small wooden structure, barely big enough for the generator, fuel cans, and various tools. Maya yanked open the door, and they tumbled inside, both breathing hard. The generator, an older model diesel, sat silent and stubborn in the corner. Jacob knelt beside it, his practiced hands already checking connections, fuel lines, air filters. He worked methodically, his movements smooth and automatic. This was something he understood, something that made sense. Machines were simple. They broke for logical reasons and could be fixed with the right tools and knowledge, if only people were the same. "Fuel lines clogged," he said after a few minutes, "and your air filters shot. Got a spare?" Maya rummaged through a supply box. "Here." They worked together in the cramped space, their breath misting in the freezing air. Jacob's fingers, still not fully recovered from his near-death march through the storm, fumbled slightly with the small screws. Maya held the flashlight steady and passed him tools without being asked, anticipating what he'd need next. It was the kind of unspoken cooperation that only came from military training. "This generator's ancient," Jacob said as he worked. "Surprised it's lasted this long." "It came with the cabin. Most of the equipment here is from the 1980s, maybe earlier. Forest Service doesn't exactly prioritize remote stations for upgrades." "When was this cabin built?" Maya paused. "Not sure exactly, 70s maybe. It was already here when I arrived. Records say it was a firewatch station before they moved operations to the tower." Jacob tightened the last connection and stood. "All right, let's see if this works." He hit the starter. The generator coughed, sputtered, then roared to life with a rattling hum that sounded like music. Inside the cabin, they could see lights flicker back on through the frost-covered window. "You're a miracle worker," Maya said, relief evident in her voice. "Just know my way around engines." Jacob wiped his hands on a rag, "though I'd recommend getting a new generator before next winter. This one's on its last legs." They fought their way back to the cabin, the wind now so strong it nearly knocked them off their feet. Once inside, they shed their outer layers and stood by the fire, both shivering despite themselves. "Thank you," Maya said, pouring them both fresh hot tea. "Really, if that had died for the night—" "You'd have been fine," Jacob interrupted. "You've got the fireplace, plenty of wood, emergency supplies. You would have made it." "Maybe, but this is a lot better." She handed him a mug and raised her own. "To not freezing to death." Jacob clinked his mug against hers. "I'll drink to that." They settled back into their chairs by the fire. The cabin felt smaller now, more intimate. Outside, the storm raged with no sign of stopping. The radio on Maya's desk crackled with static and occasional bursts of weather warnings. Wind speeds over 60 miles per hour. Visibility 0. All roads closed. The storm was expected to continue through the night and into the next day. They were stuck here, together. Hours passed. They talked, cautiously at first, then with growing ease. Maya told him about growing up in Seattle, about joining the army to escape a family that expected her to become a doctor or lawyer, about the 2 tours in Iraq that had been equal parts boredom and terror. She talked about coming home and feeling like an alien in her own life, about the job offers that all felt wrong, about finding peace in the mountains where the only expectations were survival. Jacob, in turn, shared pieces of his own story. The small town in Montana where he grew up. His brother Daniel, 4 years younger, who followed him everywhere. The decision to enlist together because they thought it would be an adventure. The firefight in Afghanistan that took Daniel's life while Jacob walked away with nothing but a scar on his shoulder and a wound in his soul that never stopped bleeding. "That's why you're out here," Maya said softly. It wasn't a question. Jacob nodded. "Couldn't stay in town, couldn't look at my parents, couldn't walk past his empty room. Every day was a reminder that I came home and he didn't." "You know it wasn't your fault." "Everyone says that." Jacob's voice was flat. "Doesn't make it true." Maya was quiet for a moment. "I lost people too. 3 soldiers from my unit. One was my best friend, Emily. We used to joke that we'd open a bar together when we got out, call it the deployment lounge or something stupid like that." Her voice caught slightly. "She died in a mortar attack 6 weeks before we were supposed to rotate home. I was 50 feet away, didn't get a scratch." Jacob looked at her. Their eyes met across the firelight, and in that moment, they saw each other clearly. 2 people carrying the same weight, the same guilt, the same unanswerable question of why them and not me. "We're quite a pair," Jacob said finally. Maya almost smiled. "Yeah, we really are." The wind suddenly screamed even louder, and something heavy slammed against the cabin wall. They both jumped, instincts taking over. Maya was on her feet in an instant, moving to the window. Jacob was right behind her. "Just a branch," Maya said, peering out into the darkness. "Big one, though. Hope the roof holds." They stood there together, watching the storm rage beyond the fragile barrier of glass and wood. The cabin felt suddenly very small, very vulnerable, a tiny island of warmth and light in an ocean of cold and darkness. "Hey," Jacob said. "You hear that?" Maya tilted her head, listening. "Hear what?" "That sound, like a humming or something." They both fell silent, straining to hear over the storm. And there it was, faint but distinct. A low, rhythmic sound, almost like a generator but different. Deeper. It seemed to be coming from beneath them. "That's weird," Maya said, frowning. "I've never heard that before." They moved away from the window, following the sound. It was loudest near the center of the cabin, right by the old braided rug that covered most of the floor. "Is there a basement?" Jacob asked. "Not that I know of. I was told this cabin sits on a stone foundation, no crawl space or anything." The humming continued, steady and mechanical. Jacob knelt and pressed his ear to the floor. The vibration was stronger here, almost palpable. "Help me move this rug," he said. Together, they rolled back the heavy rug, revealing worn wooden floorboards underneath. Most were weathered and grey, but in the center, there was something different. A rectangular outline, barely visible, where the boards didn't quite match the others. Maya ran her hand along the seam. "This has been cut, recently too, or at least more recently than the rest of this floor." Jacob examined the edges more closely. "There's no handle, no obvious way to open it, but look here." He pointed to small holes at the corners. "Someone put this back with screws, not nails." "Why would someone do that?" Maya asked, but her voice carried an edge of something else now, unease. "Only one way to find out." Jacob pulled a screwdriver from the tool belt still hanging on a hook by the door. "You want me to open it?" Maya hesitated, And in that hesitation, Jacob saw the same war he was fighting: curiosity versus caution, the need to know versus the fear of what knowing might cost. "Yeah," she said finally. "Open it." Jacob worked carefully, removing screws that came out far too easily, as if they'd been opened and closed many times before. With each screw removed, the humming grew slightly louder. When the last screw dropped to the floor with a small metallic clink, Jacob and Maya exchanged a look. "Together?" he asked. She nodded. They gripped the edges of the cut section and lifted. The wood came up with surprising ease, revealing darkness below and a smell that rushed up to meet them: old air, dry and stale, mixed with something else. Oil, maybe, or preservative. Jacob shone his flashlight down into the hole. Wooden stairs descended into blackness, roughly hewn but solid, and at the bottom, maybe 12 feet down, there was a floor, a concrete floor. "Jesus," Maya breathed. "There's a whole room down there." The humming was much louder now, clearly coming from the space below. Not mechanical after all, Jacob realized, but environmental. Air moving through the space, vibrating through the structure in a way that created that strange sound. "We should call this in," Maya said, but her voice lacked conviction. "And tell them what? That we found a secret basement during a blizzard? Nobody's coming out here until the storm clears anyway." Maya chewed her lip, thinking. Then, decision made, she grabbed her flashlight. "All right, but we're careful. We go down, we look, we don't touch anything we don't have to. Agreed?" Agreed. Jacob went first, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The stairs were old but solid, built by someone who knew what they were doing. Maya followed close behind, her flashlight beam crossing with his to illuminate the space below. As they descended, the temperature dropped noticeably. The walls around them were stone and then concrete, smooth and deliberate. This wasn't some rough root cellar or improvised storage space. This had been engineered. Jacob's feet hit the concrete floor. He swept his light around the space, and his breath caught in his throat. The room was maybe 15 feet square, with walls of reinforced concrete and a ceiling held up by steel beams. Against one wall stood metal shelving units, and on those shelves sat wooden crates. Dozens of them. They were old, stamped with markings Jacob couldn't quite make out in the dim light. In the corner, a newer addition, there was what looked like a dehumidifier, still running, powered by a line that ran up through a conduit in the ceiling. That explained the electrical hum. "What is this place?" Maya whispered, as if speaking too loud might wake something. Jacob approached the nearest crate. The wood was old but well-maintained, and stenciled on the side were numbers and letters. Property of Denver Museum of Natural History, followed by a date. 1978. His heart started hammering. "Maya, you need to see this." She came to stand beside him, reading the label. Her face went pale in the flashlight beam. "That's 47 years ago," she said slowly. There were more crates, each labeled similarly. Some from museums, some from private collections, some with government seals. All dated between 1976 and 1981. And in the center of the room, sitting on a heavy wooden table, was a leather-bound journal, closed but clearly preserved with care. Jacob and Maya looked at each other, the weight of discovery settling on their shoulders like snow. Whatever this was, whatever they'd just found, it wasn't just a hidden room. It was a secret. The kind that had been kept deliberately, carefully, for over 4 decades. And now it was theirs. Above them, the storm continued to rage, sealing them in with whatever truth lay sleeping in those crates, waiting 47 years to be found by 2 broken soldiers who'd come to the mountains to hide from the world. But sometimes the world has other plans. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Maya reached for the leather-bound journal first, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked it up. The cover was worn but intact, the leather soft from decades of handling. She opened it carefully, and loose pages immediately threatened to spill out. Photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes. Wait, Jacob said, stopping her. Before we go through that, maybe we should see what's actually in these crates. Confirm what we're dealing with. Maya nodded and set the journal down gently. They approached the nearest crate together. Jacob found a crowbar hanging on the wall, its handle wrapped in tape that had yellowed with age. He wedged it under the lid of the first crate and pried carefully. The nails gave way with a groan that echoed in the confined space. Inside, wrapped in cloth that might have once been white but had aged to cream, was something heavy. Jacob lifted it out and unwrapped it slowly, like he was diffusing a bomb. The cloth fell away to reveal a carved wooden mask. African, he thought, though he was no expert. The face was serene, the craftsmanship extraordinary. Even in the dim flashlight beam, he could see the detail in every curve, every line. "Oh my God," Maya breathed. She turned the mask over carefully. On the back, burned into the wood, was a small marking. "That's a museum catalogue number. I've seen them before." Jacob set the mask down and moved to another crate. This one was smaller, heavier. Inside were velvet bags, and inside those bags were coins. Gold coins. Dozens of them. Some looked ancient, Roman maybe, with faces of emperors worn smooth by time. Others were more recent. American eagles from the 1800s, their gold still bright. They moved through the room like archaeologists at a dig site, opening crate after crate. Each one held treasures that made the last seem ordinary by comparison. Pre-Columbian pottery, intact and painted with scenes of daily life. A collection of jade figurines from Asia, their green stone polished to a mirror shine. Paintings, small ones, removed from their frames and rolled carefully, each one wrapped in acid-free paper. When Jacob unrolled one partially, he recognized the style even if he didn't know the artist. This was real art, museum quality, the kind normal people only saw behind velvet ropes and glass. One crate held jewelry, not the kind you bought at a department store, but pieces that belonged in vaults. Diamond necklaces that caught the light and threw rainbows across the concrete walls. Emerald rings the size of quarters. A tiara that looked like something a queen would wear, studded with so many gems Jacob couldn't count them all. "This isn't possible," Maya said, her voice barely a whisper. "This can't be real." But it was. They both knew it was. In the corner, they found a crate that was different from the others. Newer, sealed with modern screws instead of nails. Jacob opened it carefully and found stacks of paper inside. Not old paper, but newer documentation. Inventories, photographs, appraisals. His hands shook as he lifted out the top sheet. It was a typed list, single-spaced, covering multiple pages. Each entry described an item with meticulous detail. The artifact, its origin, its estimated value, its museum catalogue number. At the bottom of the final page, in handwriting that was shaky but legible, someone had written, "Total estimated value as of 2012, $270 million, conservative estimate." Maya took the paper from his numb fingers and read it herself. Her face had gone completely white. 270 million. Jacob, that's $250 million sitting in a room under a ranger cabin in the middle of nowhere. "How?" Jacob asked, his mind reeling. "How is this here? How has nobody found this?" "I don't know, but we need to figure it out." Maya grabbed the leather journal and sat down hard on the concrete floor, her back against the wall. "Come on, let's see what this says." Jacob joined her, and together they began to read by flashlight. The journal belonged to someone named Thomas Reed. The name hit Jacob like a punch to the gut, but he said nothing, just kept reading. The entries started in 1978, written in a careful, measured hand. April 15th, 1978. Took the position at the firewatch cabin today. Remote, which is what I wanted. After everything that happened, after what I've done, I need distance. I need time to think. The mountains will give me that. May 3rd, 1978. Still getting used to the isolation. The radio is my only contact with the outside world. Strange how quiet it is up here. Back home, there was always noise. Here, There's just wind and birds and my own thoughts. Sometimes that's worse. The entries continued, mundane details of life as a ranger, observations about weather and wildlife, the occasional note about supplies or equipment maintenance. Then, in late June of 1978, everything changed. June 23rd, 1978. Something happened today that I still can't fully process. I was doing my evening patrol along the old logging road when I came across a vehicle. Station wagon crashed into a ravine about 30 feet down. Fresh, couldn't have been more than a few hours old. I climbed down to check for survivors. There were 3 men, all dead. The crash had been violent, the vehicle rolled multiple times. But that's not what made me stop cold. The back of the station wagon was loaded with crates. Wooden crates marked with museum seals. I opened one. Inside were artifacts, valuable ones. My hands shook as I opened another and another. This wasn't some random accident. These men had stolen something significant. I should have radioed it in immediately. That was my job, my duty, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the war, what I saw there, what I did. Maybe it was just instinct. But I looked at those crates and I looked at those dead thieves and I thought about what would happen if I made that call. The authorities would come. They'd take the artifacts, sure, but they'd also ask questions. They'd investigate. And investigating meant attention, meant people, meant everything I came up here to avoid. And more than that, I thought about the museums, about the insurance companies, about who really gets hurt when things like this go missing. So I made a decision. A terrible, illegal, probably insane decision. I spent the next 3 nights moving those crates, all of them. Carried them on my back, one by one, up to my cabin. It nearly killed me, but I did it. Then I went back down and I set fire to what was left of the station wagon and the bodies inside. Made it look like the fire caused the crash, not the other way around. Destroyed any evidence of what had been there. I know what I've done. I know it's wrong. But I also know those artifacts are safe now, safer than they would have been anywhere else. And maybe when I figure out what to do, I can return them properly. When the time is right. When I'm ready. Jacob stopped reading, his throat tight. Maya had gone very still beside him. Thomas Reed, she said quietly. There was a ranger named Thomas Reed who worked this sector back in the 70s and 80s. I saw his name in the old logs when I first arrived. He retired in 93, I think, or maybe 94. Jacob's mouth was dry. What happened to him? I don't know. The records just say he left the service. Why? Jacob couldn't speak for a moment. His mind was spinning, connections forming that he didn't want to acknowledge. Finally, he managed, What did he look like? Is there a photo? Maya thought for a moment, then stood. There might be. In the office, there's a wall with old photos of rangers who served here. I remember seeing one from the 80s. She headed for the stairs. Come on. They climbed back up into the cabin, the warmth a shock after the cool of the vault below. Maya went to a filing cabinet in the corner and pulled out a dusty photo album. She flipped through pages of faded photographs until she found what she was looking for. Here, she said, turning the album toward Jacob. That's him, taken in 86 according to the caption. Thomas Reed, Sector Ranger. Jacob stared at the photograph. It was old, the colors faded, but the face was unmistakable. A man in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, standing in front of this very cabin. He had a weathered face, a thick beard going grey, and eyes that held a deep sadness even through the smile. But it was the stance, the way he held himself, the shape of his jaw and the line of his nose that made Jacob's world tilt on its axis. He knew that face. He'd seen it in old family photographs, in the few pictures his father kept in a box in the attic. This man, this Thomas Reed, was his grandfather. Jacob? Maya's voice seemed to come from very far away. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. That's because I have, Jacob said, his voice hollow. That's my grandfather, Thomas Reed, my father's father. Maya's eyes went wide. What? He left when my dad was young. 1978, actually. Just walked away from the family, took a job with the Forest Service and never came back. My dad was 12. Said his father just couldn't handle civilian life after Vietnam, needed to get away from everything. They exchanged letters for a few years, then those stopped too. He died when I was 8. I barely remember him. The room felt like it was spinning. All this time, all these years, his grandfather had been living up here, guarding a secret worth $270 million, protecting stolen treasures in a concrete vault beneath a ranger cabin while his family wondered why he'd abandoned them. "Jacob," Maya said gently, placing a hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry. This must be insane?" Jacob laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, that's exactly what it is." He sank into one of the chairs by the fire, the photo album still in his hands. He stared at his grandfather's face, trying to reconcile the man in the picture with the man he barely remembered. Sparse visits when he was very young, awkward and brief. A funeral he'd been too young to really understand. And now this. "We need to keep reading," Maya said quietly. "Maybe the journal explains more. Maybe it explains why he did what he did." Jacob nodded numbly, and they returned to the vault, to the journal, to the story his grandfather had left behind. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The later entries in Thomas Reed's journal painted a picture of a man trapped by his own decision. He documented everything obsessively, each artifact, its condition, the measures he took to preserve it. He'd built the vault in the summer of '79, working at night, using materials he claimed in small quantities over months, so no one would notice. The dehumidifier had been added in '91, along with a dedicated power line he'd run from the generator. But between the technical details were glimpses of something deeper, something more human and broken. August 7th, 1979. Some nights I dream about that station wagon burning, about the bodies inside. I tell myself they were thieves, that they chose their path, but that doesn't make the nightmares stop. I've killed men before in the war, but this feels different. This feels more personal somehow, more calculated. I didn't pull a trigger, but I might as well have. November 20th, 1981. Got a letter from my son today. He's 14 now. Wants to know when I'm coming home for Christmas. I wrote back and said the station was short-staffed, that I couldn't leave. Truth is, I can't face him. Can't face any of them. How do you sit at a dinner table and pass the potatoes when you're hiding $200 million in stolen art under your floor? How do you look your kid in the eye? March 2nd, 1984. Tried to figure out how to return the artifacts today. Really tried. Sat down with maps and phone numbers and scenarios. But every path leads to questions I can't answer. How did I find them? Why did I wait so long? What about the burned vehicle, the bodies? The lies compound upon lies. I've waited too long. I'm trapped in my own secret. The entries became less frequent in the late 80s, sporadic and darker. Depression seeped through every word. Thomas wrote about isolation, about guilt, about the weight of carrying a secret that grew heavier with each passing year. He wrote about his family and the distance that had grown into a chasm he no longer knew how to cross. Then, in '92, something shifted. June 14th, 1992. Met a Vietnam vet at the supply depot today. Younger than me, maybe 30, said he'd just gotten out of the army. We got to talking, the way vets do. He told me about his time in Desert Storm, about the things he'd seen, the things he'd done. And then he said something that stuck with me. Sometimes the best thing you can do is survive. Just survive and try not to let the darkness win. I realized something. I've been so focused on my guilt, on my mistakes, that I forgot the original purpose. These artifacts, they're safe. They've been safe for 14 years because I kept them safe. Maybe that matters. Maybe that's enough. I've decided I'm going to document everything, every piece, every detail. Create a full inventory with photographs and appraisals. That way, if something happens to me, if I'm found out or I die, or I finally work up the courage to come forward, there will be a record. A complete record. Nothing will be lost. And that's what he'd done. The rest of the journal was filled with meticulous documentation. Each artifact photographed, described, researched. Thomas had spent years in libraries during his rare trips to town, looking up provenance, tracking down original exhibition catalogues, estimating values. He'd created something extraordinary, a complete archive of one of the largest art heists in American history. Because that's what this was, Jacob realized as he read. The crates, the timing, the museums involved. He remembered hearing about it years ago, maybe in a documentary or a news retrospective. The summer of '78, a coordinated robbery of 4 major museums across Colorado and Wyoming. Thieves had hit them all within a 3-week period, making off with hundreds of items of cultural significance. The theft had never been solved, the artifacts never recovered. It had been one of the great unsolved crimes of the 20th century, until now. "The Centennial Heist," Maya said suddenly, her voice sharp with recognition. "That's what this is. I remember reading about it in college, cultural anthropology class. The professor used it as an example of how priceless artifacts can vanish without proper security." She pulled out her phone, then cursed. "No signal. Of course not. We're in a concrete room during a blizzard." She looked at Jacob. "But I'm right. This has to be it. The timing matches, the museums match. Your grandfather stumbled onto the biggest unsolved art theft in Colorado history, and instead of turning it in, he hid it. For 47 years, Jacob added, his voice distant. They sat in silence, the weight of it pressing down on them. Above, the storm continued to rage. Down here, surrounded by treasures worth more money than either of them could really comprehend, they felt very small and very lost. "There's more," Maya said, flipping to the back of the journal. "Look, the final entries were dated much later, from 2010 and 2011. The handwriting was shakier, the words sometimes difficult to read. January 8th, 2010. I'm 74 years old and I'm dying. Doctors say I have maybe 2 years, probably less. Lung cancer, likely from all those years breathing in wood smoke and diesel fumes. Ironic, really. I survived Vietnam, survived my own guilt, survived 4 decades of isolation, and it's my lungs that finally give out. I need to make arrangements. The artifacts need to be protected after I'm gone. I've updated the preservation systems, improved the dehumidification, created multiple backup inventories, but I still haven't figured out how to return them. Maybe that's for someone else to figure out. Maybe that's the real legacy I leave behind. Not the keeping of the secret, but the burden of ending it. April 19th, 2011. This is probably my last entry. I'm too weak to write much anymore. I wanted to say something profound, something that would explain or justify or excuse what I've done, but the truth is simpler and sadder than that. I was a broken man who made a broken choice. I told myself I was protecting these treasures, and maybe I was. But I was also protecting myself. From questions, from judgment, from having to face what I'd become. I thought isolation would save me, would give me peace. Instead, it just gave me time to realize how much I'd lost. If someone finds this, if someone reads these words, know this. The artifacts are real, they're valuable, and they belong to the people. Not to me, not to thieves, but to museums and scholars and anyone who wants to understand where we came from. Return them, please. Finish what I couldn't. And if by some chance your family, if you're my son or his children, know that I loved you. Know that walking away was the worst mistake of my life, worse even than hiding millions in stolen art. I thought I was protecting you from my darkness. I was wrong. I should have stayed, I should have tried, but I didn't. And now it's too late. So all I can do is hope that somehow, some way, some good comes from this mess. That these treasures find their way home. That my absence meant something. That the silence I chose wasn't completely in vain. Thomas Reed, April 2011. Jacob's vision blurred. He didn't realize he was crying until tears hit the page, smudging ink that was already more than a decade old. Maya's hand found his shoulder and squeezed gently. He thought he was protecting you, she said softly. He was wrong, but he thought he was doing the right thing. He should have come home, Jacob said, his voice breaking. "My dad spent his whole life wondering why his father didn't love him enough to stay. And it was this. It was all because of this." "No," Maya said firmly. "It was because of trauma and guilt and making one bad choice that spiraled into a lifetime of bad choices. But the love was there, Jacob. It's right there in his words. He loved you. He just didn't know how to show it." Jacob wiped his eyes roughly, anger and grief warring inside him. "What do we do? With all of this, what the hell do we do?" Maya stood and began pacing the small vault, her mind clearly working through scenarios. "Legally, we have to report this. These artifacts were stolen. They belong to museums, to the public. The insurance companies probably still have open claims. This is evidence in multiple felonies." "But my grandfather—" "Your grandfather did something illegal," Maya interrupted, not unkindly. "What happened to him was tragic. What he went through was real trauma. But hiding stolen cultural treasures for 4 decades isn't something we can just overlook. These pieces, some of them are probably one of a kind, irreplaceable. Museums have been looking for them for almost 50 years. Jacob knew she was right. Of course she was right. But the thought of his grandfather's name being dragged through the news, of his family finding out this way, of everything being exposed and judged and dissected by strangers made him feel sick. "There's something else," Maya said, her voice softer now. She held up a small envelope that had been tucked into the back of the journal. "This is addressed to whoever finds this, dated 2011. With shaking hands, Jacob took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting barely legible, but unmistakably his grandfather's. "To whoever finds this collection, by now you've read the journal. You know what I did and what I failed to do. You're probably wondering why I didn't just come forward, why I didn't make an anonymous tip, why I let this drag on for so many years. The truth is I tried more times than I can count, but every time I got close, fear stopped me. Fear of prison, fear of judgment, fear of destroying what little I had left of my dignity. But I'm past fear now. I'm dying, and the only thing I'm afraid of anymore is that these artifacts will be lost forever. That my cowardice will mean that priceless pieces of human history will rot in a concrete box under a cabin nobody remembers. So I'm trusting you, whoever you are, to do what I couldn't. Return these pieces. Contact the authorities. Contact the museums. Contact whoever you need to. Tell them where the artifacts are. Tell them they've been preserved and protected. And if they ask about me, tell them I was a coward and a thief. But tell them also that I kept these treasures safe when no one else could. I've left detailed inventories, photographs, documentation. Everything you need to make this right is here. The only thing missing is the courage I never found. I hope you have it. I hope you're stronger than I was. With regret and hope, Thomas Reed." Jacob read the letter 3 times, his grandfather's words burning into his memory. The man had spent 40 years trapped by a single decision, crushed under the weight of guilt and isolation, unable to move forward or backward. And now, somehow, that burden had passed to Jacob. "He wants us to finish it," Maya said. "That's what this whole thing is. He set it up so that whoever found it could complete what he started. By turning himself in posthumously," Jacob added, "by making sure the world knows what he did. But also making sure the artifacts are saved. That's what matters to him most in the end. Not his reputation, not his legacy, but that these pieces make it home." Jacob looked around the vault at the crates, at the treasures his grandfather had protected at such terrible cost to himself and his family. He thought about his father, who'd spent his whole life feeling abandoned, not knowing that his father had been less than 200 miles away, trapped in a prison of his own making. He thought about Daniel, his brother, and how guilt could drive you to do irrational things, could make you run from the very people who might save you. And he thought about himself, living alone in the mountains for 6 years, hiding from a world that hurt too much to face. Was he really that different from his grandfather? Were any of them really that different? All just broken people trying to survive their own darkness? "We call it in," Jacob said finally, his voice steady despite everything. "As soon as the storm clears and we can get a signal, we call the authorities. We give them everything. The journal, the inventories, the artifacts, all of it. Maya nodded. Your grandfather's name will come out. I know, but he wanted it to. That's what the letter says. He wanted the truth told, even if it destroyed him. Jacob stood, his decision made. Besides, what's the alternative? We hide it again. We keep living with this secret. That didn't work for him, and it won't work for us. There could be legal trouble, Maya warned. Questions about why we waited, why we didn't report it immediately. We report it as soon as humanly possible, Jacob countered. We're trapped in a blizzard with no communication. The second we can safely call, we call. Nobody can fault us for that. Maya studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Okay. Then that's what we do. Together. Together, Jacob agreed. They climbed back up into the cabin, the warmth of the fire a stark contrast to the cool vault below. The storm outside showed no signs of stopping. Through the window they could see nothing but white, the world reduced to wind and snow and darkness. How long do you think we're stuck here? Jacob asked. Maya checked the weather radio. Storm's supposed to break sometime tomorrow afternoon, maybe evening. Roads won't be clear for days, but we should be able to get a signal once the weather calms down. So we wait. We wait. They sat by the fire, both lost in thought. The cabin felt different now, heavier, charged with the weight of what lay beneath. $270 million in stolen treasures, 47 years of secrets, one man's guilt and one man's redemption, separated by decades and connected by blood. Outside, the storm howled on, burying the world in snow and silence. Inside, two strangers who'd become something more sat together in the firelight, preparing to expose a truth that had been hidden longer than either of them had been alive. And beneath them, in the darkness and the cold, priceless treasures waited patiently to finally go home. The storm didn't break the next afternoon as predicted. If anything, it intensified. By the time dawn crept grey and reluctant through the frost-covered windows, the world outside had disappeared completely beneath feet of fresh snow. The wind had shifted directions 3 times during the night, building drifts that reached halfway up the cabin walls. Inside, Jacob and Maya had barely slept. They'd spent most of the night talking, the kind of deep, raw conversation that only happens when two people find themselves in extraordinary circumstances with nothing left to hide behind. The fire had burned low and been rebuilt 6 times. Coffee had been made and consumed until their hands shook from caffeine, and slowly, piece by piece, they'd shared the stories they usually kept locked away. Jacob had told her everything about Daniel. Not just the basic facts he'd shared earlier, but the real story, the one that lived in his nightmares. How Daniel had been the funny one, the charming one, the kid who could make friends anywhere and saw good in everyone. How he'd followed Jacob into the Marines, not because he wanted to be a soldier, but because he wanted to be like his big brother. How Jacob had promised their parents he'd watch out for him, keep him safe, bring him home. The firefight had happened in Helmand Province in 2009. Their unit had been on a routine patrol, something they'd done 100 times before. Daniel had been 22 years old, still young enough to believe he was invincible. The IED hit the lead vehicle. Chaos erupted, and in the confusion, in the smoke and screaming and gunfire, Daniel had moved to help a wounded Marine. I saw him go, Jacob said, his voice hollow with memory. I screamed at him to wait, to let me go first. But he didn't hear me, or he didn't want to. He always had to be the hero, you know. Always had to be the one helping. Maya sat quietly, letting him talk. The second explosion killed him instantly. That's what they told me later, like it was supposed to be a comfort. Like knowing he didn't suffer made it better somehow. Jacob's hands clenched around his coffee mug. I was 15 feet away, 15 feet close enough to watch but too far to stop it. And I froze. For maybe 3 seconds I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. That's shock, Maya said softly. That's trauma. You didn't freeze, you were in shock. Doesn't matter what you call it. Those 3 seconds were the difference between life and death. If I'd moved faster, if I'd gotten to him first, if I'd tackled him before he reached that spot. Jacob's voice cracked. "I promised my parents. I promised them I'd bring him home." "You couldn't have known," Maya said. "You couldn't have stopped it." "Everyone says that," Jacob shot back, anger flashing. "Everyone's got an excuse ready. But I was there. I was his brother, his team leader, his protector. And I failed. That's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. I failed and he died, and I get to live with that forever." The silence that followed was thick and painful. Then Maya spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I killed someone," she said. Jacob looked up sharply. Maya stared into her mug, not meeting his eyes. "Iraq, 2007. We were stationed outside Baghdad, doing convoy security. One night we got intelligence about a suicide bomber planning to hit the base. We were on high alert, everyone jumpy as hell. I was manning a checkpoint when a vehicle approached, moving too fast, not slowing down like they were supposed to." Her hands trembled slightly. "I signaled, I shouted, I did everything by the book, but the vehicle kept coming, and I made the call. I opened fire." Jacob waited, knowing where this was going, knowing the weight of what came next. "There was no bomber," Maya continued. "Just a father trying to get his sick daughter to a hospital. He was scared, panicked, not thinking clearly. My bullets killed him. The daughter survived, but her father died right there in the street, while I stood over him trying to do CPR with hands covered in his blood." She finally looked at Jacob, her eyes dry but haunted. "The investigation cleared me, said I followed protocol, made the right call given the circumstances. But that man's face, I see it every night when I close my eyes, every single night for 18 years. "Maya," Jacob started, but she shook her head. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you this so you understand. What happened to your brother, that wasn't your fault. You couldn't have saved him any more than I could have saved that father. War puts us in impossible situations and then judges us for the choices we make in half a second. But the guilt, that stays. That's what we carry." They sat together in that shared understanding, two people bound by different tragedies, but the same crushing weight of survivor's guilt. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, something shifted between them, a connection forged not from attraction or convenience, but from recognition. They saw each other clearly, completely, in a way few people ever do. "Is that why you're up here?" Jacob asked. "Why you requested the most remote posting the Forest Service had?" Maya nodded slowly. "After I got out, I tried to go back to normal life. Went to college on the GI Bill, studied environmental science. Got a job with the Forest Service in California, worked my way up. But I couldn't shake it, couldn't escape what I'd done. The cities felt wrong, too loud, too many people. I needed space to breathe." "And then?" Jacob prompted. Maya's jaw tightened. "And then I found out my supervisor was taking bribes. Logging companies paying him to look the other way while they clear-cut protected areas. I reported it, went through proper channels, did everything right. You know what happened? They covered it up. Worse, they promoted him and transferred me, said I was too inflexible, needed to learn that sometimes conservation requires compromise." She spat the word like it was poison. "Compromise. That's what they called corruption. So I requested the most isolated, least political posting I could find, and I ended up here." "Running from people," Jacob said. "Just like you." They looked at each other, a sad smile passing between them. Two broken people hiding in the mountains, trying to outrun their pasts, only to find themselves sitting on one of the biggest discoveries in modern history. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "We can't run from this one," Maya said. "This is too big." "I know." As morning stretched into afternoon, they made preparations. Maya tried the satellite phone repeatedly, but the storm interference made communication impossible. The radio crackled with static and occasional fragments of weather updates. The storm was expected to clear by evening, maybe midnight. Until then, they were isolated. Jacob spent time organizing his grandfather's documentation, creating a clear timeline of events, making sure everything was ready to present to authorities. Maya drafted a formal report, documenting how they'd discovered the vault, what they'd found, and their actions since. They both knew that the moment they reported this, their lives would change forever. Media attention, investigations, questions, scrutiny. Nothing would be private anymore. "Are you ready for that?" Maya asked as Jacob sealed the journal into a protective bag. "Once this gets out, once people know who your grandfather was, what he did, they'll make him either a villain or a hero," Jacob finished. "Probably both. Some people will call him a thief. Others will say he was protecting cultural treasures. Everyone will have an opinion about a man they never met, about choices they never had to make." "It'll affect your family," Maya warned. "Your father, other relatives. This will become part of your family history." Jacob thought about that. His father, now in his early 60s, living quietly in Montana. The man had spent his whole life with the wound of abandonment, wondering why his father chose the mountains over his family. This would give him an answer, but would it be one he wanted? "He deserves the truth," Jacob said finally. "Good or bad, he deserves to know why his father left. And maybe in some way, this can help him heal. Help all of us heal." By 5 o'clock, the storm finally began to ease. The wind dropped from a scream to a moan. The snow, which had been falling in thick curtains, thinned to scattered flakes. Visibility improved from 0 to maybe 50 feet, then 100. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Maya grabbed the satellite phone and stepped outside onto the covered porch. The cold hit like a slap, but she was dressed for it now, bundled in layers. Jacob watched through the window as she tried to establish a connection. The phone held high, antenna extended. 5 minutes later, she came back inside, her face grim. "I got through to the ranger station at the base, barely. Connection kept cutting out, but I managed to report what we found. They're contacting the FBI and state police." "How long until someone can get here?" Maya shook her head. "That's the problem. The roads are completely impassable. Highway Patrol says it'll be at least 2 days before they can even attempt to clear the main routes, longer for the back roads that lead up here. They're talking about helicopter extraction, but the weather's still too dangerous for that." "So we wait," Jacob said. "So we wait," Maya agreed. "They said to secure the site. Don't let anyone in. Don't touch anything else. A team will get here as soon as possible." They should have felt relieved. They'd done their duty, reported the find, set the wheels of justice in motion. But instead, Jacob felt uneasy, a prickle at the back of his neck that had saved his life more than once in combat. Something felt wrong. "What is it?" Maya asked, reading his expression. "I don't know, maybe nothing. But that call you made, it went through official channels, right? Ranger station to FBI to state police?" "Yeah, why?" "How many people know?" Jacob asked. "How many people heard about 270 million in recovered art sitting in a remote cabin during a blizzard with no backup possible for days?" Maya's face went pale as the realization hit. "Oh God, every dispatcher, every supervisor, every officer who heard the report, and their families, and their friends. Jacob, news like this doesn't stay quiet. It can't." As if on cue, Maya's personal cell phone, which she'd had charging by the generator, suddenly lit up with notifications. The storm had cleared just enough for cell service to return sporadically. Text messages and calls flooded in, all from the same number, her supervisor at the district office. She answered the last call. "This is Chen." Even from across the room, Jacob could hear the man shouting. "Where the hell have you been? I've been trying to reach you for 3 hours. Is it true? Did you really find the Centennial heist collection?" "Sir, I filed a report through proper channels." "It's already on the news, Chen. Someone leaked it to a reporter, and now it's everywhere. Every major outlet is running the story. Treasure worth hundreds of millions found in remote ranger cabin. They're calling it the discovery of the century." Maya's hand tightened on the phone. "Sir, the site is secure. We're waiting for the FBI. The FBI can't get to you. Nobody can. But that won't stop people from trying. You need to understand what you're sitting on. That collection, there are people who've been looking for it for 50 years. Treasure hunters, criminals, collectors who don't care about laws, and now they all know exactly where it is." The call dropped. Connection lost. Maya lowered the phone slowly, her face ashen. "He's right," she said. "We're in trouble. Jacob was already moving, his combat instincts kicking in. He went to the window and scanned what he could see of the surrounding area. The storm had left the landscape transformed, buried under snow, but there were still approaches to the cabin. Roads, trails, valleys that could be navigated by someone desperate enough. "How far is the nearest town?" he asked. 15 miles by road, maybe 10 cross-country if you know the trails. "And the roads?" "Impassable for normal vehicles, but snowmobiles could do it. ATVs with chains, maybe. Someone really determined could hike it." Jacob's mind raced through scenarios, probabilities, threat assessments. "How long since you made the call to the ranger station?"
2 hours, maybe a little more.
"And how long has the news been public?" Maya checked her phone, scrolling through messages. First news alert was 90 minutes ago. "So anyone within 50 miles has known for at least an hour," Jacob said, "which means anyone planning to come here has had an hour to prepare. And with the roads closed, with no police able to respond, this is the perfect time to make a move."
You think someone's actually coming? Now? In this weather?
"For $270 million? Jacob gave her a hard look. "People have killed for a lot less, and we just broadcast to the world that it's sitting here unguarded with 2 people and no backup coming." Maya swore and grabbed her radio. "I need to contact the ranger station again, tell them to send whoever they can, weather be damned." But the radio crackled with nothing but static. The brief window of clear communication had closed. They were cut off again. Jacob moved through the cabin with military precision, assessing defenses. Windows? Just the one in front and 2 small ones in back. They're double-paned, fairly sturdy. Door? Solid oak, heavy deadbolt. There's also a back door that leads to the equipment shed. That's 2 points of entry that need coverage. Jacob checked the shed door. It had a simple lock, nothing that would stop a determined intruder. "We need to reinforce this." They spent the next hour turning the cabin into a defensible position. Jacob used tools from the shed to add braces to both doors. They moved furniture to create barriers, positioned supplies within easy reach. Maya had a Ranger-issued sidearm, a 9mm with 2 spare magazines. Not much, but better than nothing. Jacob found an old hunting rifle in a cabinet, a 30-06 with a box of ammunition that looked decades old but still good. "Ever been in a firefight?" Jacob asked as they worked. "Twice in Iraq, you?" "More than I can count." They shared a look, the unspoken understanding passing between them. If it came to violence, they both knew what to do. They'd been trained for it, had survived it before. But that didn't make the prospect any less terrifying. By the time they finished preparations, night had fallen. The cabin was dark except for the firelight, all exterior lights turned off. They didn't want to make themselves an obvious target. Maya kept watch at the front window while Jacob monitored the back. They'd extinguished the fire to avoid the telltale smoke, relying on their body heat and winter gear for warmth. "Maybe we're overreacting," Maya said quietly. "Maybe nobody's crazy enough to come out in this." "Maybe," Jacob agreed, but he didn't believe it and neither did she. At 9:37, they heard the first engine. It came from the east, a high-pitched whine that could only be a snowmobile. Jacob moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. Through the darkness and scattered snow, he could see lights, multiple lights, moving through the trees. 3 snowmobiles, he said, maybe 4. They're coming up the old fire road. Maya joined him at the window. "Could be rangers, could be search and rescue checking on us." At night, in these conditions, without radio contact first? They both knew the answer. These weren't rescuers. The snowmobiles stopped about 200 yards from the cabin, just at the edge of the clearing. The engines cut off one by one, plunging the night back into relative silence. Dark figures dismounted, at least 6 of them, maybe more. They gathered in a group, clearly conferring, planning. Then flashlight beams started sweeping the area. "They're scoping it out," Jacob said, "looking for the best approach, checking for defenses." "What do we do?" "We try talking first. If they're just treasure hunters looking to get lucky, maybe we can scare them off. But if they're serious..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Maya grabbed a megaphone from her ranger supplies, opened the front door a crack, and shouted into the darkness. "This is Ranger Maya Chen. This area is under federal protection and currently part of an active FBI investigation. You need to leave immediately." The flashlight beams swung toward the cabin, blinding and hostile. A voice called back, male, rough, with an accent Jacob couldn't quite place. "We're not here to hurt anyone, Ranger. We just want to see what you found. It's a discovery for all mankind, right? Should be shared." "The artifacts will be shared through proper channels," Maya shouted back. "Museums and scholars will have full access once they're secured. But right now you're interfering with a federal investigation. Leave or face prosecution." A different voice, younger, responded. "Come on, lady. You're sitting on hundreds of millions. You really think the government's gonna let you keep any of it? They'll take everything and give you a certificate and a pat on the head. At least we're being honest about what we want." Jacob pulled Maya back and closed the door. "They're not leaving." "Then what?" "Then we hold position until help arrives. We've got food, water, heat from the fireplace if we need it. They're the ones exposed to the elements. Time is on our side." But even as he said it, Jacob knew it wasn't that simple. The people outside weren't desperate fools. They'd planned this, brought equipment, traveled through dangerous conditions. They wanted what was in that vault, and they'd be willing to wait, to watch, to find a weakness. An hour passed, then another. The figures outside didn't leave, but they didn't attack either. They set up a camp of sorts, tarps and portable heaters visible in the glow of their lights. They were settling in, making it clear they weren't going anywhere. "This is a siege," Maya said quietly. "Yeah." "How long can we hold?" Jacob thought about it. "We've got supplies for maybe a week if we're careful. But they don't need a week. They just need us to make a mistake, to leave an opening, and eventually we'll have to sleep. So we take shifts, 4 hours on, 4 hours off. We can manage that for a couple days until the road's clear." It was a plan, not a great one, but the only option they had. Jacob took the first watch, positioning himself where he could see both doors and the main window. Maya lay down on the cot, still fully dressed, her weapon within reach. Despite everything, exhaustion claimed her within minutes. Jacob watched the darkness beyond the windows, his mind alert, his body tense. He thought about his grandfather, about the choices that had led to this moment. Thomas Reed had hidden the treasures to protect them, but in doing so, he'd created a target. And now, 47 years later, that target had finally been found. At 2 in the morning, something changed. Jacob noticed movement closer to the cabin, shadows detaching from shadows. They were testing the perimeter, probing for weaknesses. He nudged Maya awake. "They're moving." Maya was alert instantly, years of military training overriding grogginess. She took position at the back window while Jacob covered the front. They watched as figures crept closer, spreading out, trying to surround the cabin. "They're coordinating," Maya whispered. "This isn't random. They've done this before." "Professional treasure hunters," Jacob agreed. "Or worse." A figure approached the front door, bold now, unconcerned with stealth. He knocked, almost politely. "Hey, let's talk! No need for this to get ugly." Jacob said nothing, just kept his rifle trained on the door. "Come on, we know you're in there. Look, we're not unreasonable people. Give us a few pieces, just a small cut, and we'll go away. You keep the rest. Tell your FBI friends whatever story you want. Everybody wins." Still silence from inside. "Or," the voice continued, harder now, "we can do this the difficult way. We've got time, we've got supplies, and we've got enough people to make sure you don't get any sleep. Eventually, you'll slip up, and when you do, we're coming in." Jacob and Maya exchanged glances. The threat was real, and they both knew it. "What if we just gave them something?" Maya whispered. "One artifact, something small, just to make them leave." "You really think they'd leave?" Jacob asked. "We give them a taste and they'll want more. Plus, anything we give them is something stolen from its rightful place. We might as well be thieves ourselves." "So we fight?" "We hold," Jacob corrected. "We defend, but we don't escalate unless they do." The standoff continued through the night. The people outside tried various tactics. Loud noises meant to keep them awake, threats, promises of wealth if they'd just cooperate. At one point, someone threw something at the cabin, a rock that cracked but didn't break the front window. As dawn approached, grey and cold, Jacob and Maya were exhausted but holding. They'd maintained their watch schedule, kept the doors secured, and hadn't given an inch. But they both knew this couldn't last forever. And then, just as the sun began to paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, they heard something new. Another engine, deeper, more powerful, helicopter rotors cutting through the morning air. Relief flooded through Jacob so intensely he nearly dropped his rifle. They made it. Help got through. The helicopter appeared over the ridge, a search and rescue bird with Forest Service markings. It circled the cabin once, taking in the scene below. The cabin, the scattered camp of treasure hunters, the tense standoff frozen in the new daylight. A loudspeaker crackled to life from the helicopter. "This is federal jurisdiction. Everyone except Ranger Chen and Jacob Reed needs to leave the area immediately. State police are en route. Anyone remaining will be arrested." The effect was immediate. The treasure hunters scattered, running for their snowmobiles, desperate to escape before law enforcement arrived in force. Within minutes, the clearing was empty, except for the cabin and the helicopter slowly descending to land. Jacob and Maya stumbled out into the dawn, exhausted, relieved, and alive. They'd protected the Discovery through the longest night of their lives. They'd held their ground against impossible odds. And they'd done it together. As federal agents and state police began arriving by helicopter and snowcat, as the cabin was secured and the vault documented, and the treasures finally prepared for their journey home, Jacob and Maya stood apart from the chaos for just a moment. "We did it," Maya said, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Yeah," Jacob agreed, "we did." And in that moment, both of them knew that something had changed. They'd come to these mountains to hide, to escape, to avoid the pain of human connection. But through this ordeal, through shared danger and shared purpose, they'd found something neither had expected. They'd found each other. The media descended like a second blizzard. Within 48 hours of the helicopter rescue, the remote mountain cabin that had been Jacob and Maya's refuge became the center of a storm unlike anything either of them had experienced. News vans lined the cleared roads as far as the eye could see. Satellite trucks sprouted from the snow like mechanical mushrooms. Reporters from every major network jockeyed for position, their carefully styled hair and makeup absurd against the backdrop of wilderness and cold. "Ranger Chen, how does it feel to make the discovery of the century?" "Jacob Reed, is it true your grandfather was the one who hid the treasures? Can you confirm the collection is worth $270 million? What was going through your mind when you opened that vault?" Jacob and Maya stood on the cabin's front porch, flanked by FBI agents and Forest Service supervisors, facing a wall of cameras and shouted questions. They'd been up for nearly 36 hours straight, giving statements, answering questions, documenting every detail of their discovery. Jacob's eyes burned with exhaustion. Maya's voice had gone hoarse, but the questions kept coming. Special Agent Rebecca Sutton, the FBI's lead investigator on the case, stepped forward and raised her hands for silence. She was a woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair and the kind of presence that made even aggressive reporters back down. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll have a full press conference this afternoon. For now, what I can tell you is this. 2 days ago, Ranger Maya Chen and civilian Jacob Reed discovered what appears to be the complete collection stolen in the Centennial heist of 1978. Initial assessment confirms the authenticity of the artifacts. The estimated value is substantial, though we won't have exact figures until full appraisals are completed." "Agent Sutton," a reporter called out, "is it true that Thomas Reed, Jacob's grandfather, was responsible for hiding the collection?" Sutton's expression remained neutral. "The investigation is ongoing. What I can say is that Thomas Reed, who served as a ranger in this sector from 1978 to 1994, appears to have been the individual who secured and preserved the artifacts. His journals and documentation have been invaluable to our investigation." "Was he one of the original thieves?" "No. Sutton said firmly. Based on evidence recovered, Thomas Reed was not involved in the original theft. The exact circumstances of how he came to possess the artifacts are detailed in his personal journals, which will be released to the public pending completion of our investigation.
Another reporter shouted, "Will there be charges filed against his estate, against Jacob Reed?" There is no evidence that Jacob Reed had any prior knowledge of the artifacts. He discovered them by accident during the storm and immediately reported them to authorities through proper channels. As for Thomas Reed's estate, he left detailed documentation and a letter explicitly requesting that the artifacts be returned to their rightful owners. At this time, we see no benefit in pursuing charges against a deceased individual who appears to have acted, however imperfectly, to preserve cultural treasures.
Jacob felt something loosen in his chest. His grandfather wouldn't be vilified. The truth was complicated, but it was being told fairly. The press conference that afternoon was held in the valley town of Copper Ridge, the nearest community with facilities large enough to handle the media circus. Jacob and Maya sat at a table beside Agent Sutton, museum representatives, and various law enforcement officials. Behind them, displayed on screens, were photographs of some of the recovered artifacts: the African mask, the pre-Columbian pottery, the Renaissance paintings, the ancient coins. Dr. Patricia Yun, director of the Denver Museum of Natural History, one of the original victims of the theft, spoke with tears in her eyes. We had given up hope. After 47 years, we assumed these pieces were lost forever, destroyed or sold to private collectors who would never let them see daylight. To have them returned, intact, preserved with such obvious care, it's nothing short of miraculous. She looked directly at Jacob. Your grandfather may have made questionable choices, but he saved these treasures. Without his protection, they would have been scattered to the winds, sold piece by piece, lost to humanity forever. Whatever his motivations, whatever his fears, Thomas Reed was a guardian, and history will remember him as such.
Jacob's throat tightened. Beside him, Maya reached under the table and squeezed his hand.
The questions continued for over 2 hours. Reporters wanted every detail: how they'd found the vault, what it had been like to see the treasures, how they'd survived the standoff with the treasure hunters. Maya handled it with military precision, sticking to facts, avoiding speculation. Jacob spoke less but more emotionally, talking about his grandfather, about legacy, about the weight of secrets. Finally, near the end, a young reporter asked the question that changed everything. There are reports that the insurance companies who paid out claims on these stolen artifacts are now attempting to claim ownership. If that happens, neither the museums nor the finders would see anything. What's your response?
Agent Sutton leaned forward. The legal situation is complex. However, given that the artifacts were preserved through the actions of a private individual and recovered by Mr. Reed and Ranger Chen, there are strong arguments for finder's fees under both state and federal law. Those negotiations are ongoing.
What she didn't say, but what Jacob learned in private meetings over the following weeks, was that the legal battle was fierce. Insurance companies claimed the artifacts as their property since they'd paid out the claims decades ago. Museums argued they were the rightful owners since the insurance payments had never fully covered the losses. The state of Colorado wanted a piece for its role in recovery. And through it all, lawyers representing Jacob argued that without his discovery and his immediate protection of the site, none of this would have been recovered at all. In the end, after 3 months of negotiations, a settlement was reached. The artifacts would return to the museums that originally owned them. The insurance companies would be reimbursed for their payments plus interest, and Jacob and Maya would split a finder's fee of $18 million. $18 million. Jacob sat in the lawyer's office in Denver, staring at the number on the settlement document, and couldn't process it. He'd been living on less than $20,000 a year for the past 6 years, hunting and fishing for most of his food, patching his clothes until they fell apart. And now someone was handing him $9 million for finding something his grandfather had hidden. "It's real," Maya said beside him. She'd been equally stunned by her share. "This is really happening." "What are you going to do with it?" Jacob asked.
Maya was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. Part of me wants to refuse it, donate it all. This doesn't feel earned. Your lawyer would kill you, Jacob said with a slight smile. Probably. She looked at him. What about you? Jacob thought about his cabin in the woods, about the 6 years he'd spent hiding from the world. He thought about his brother Daniel, about all the veterans he'd met over the years who were struggling just like he was. He thought about his grandfather's letter, about finishing what someone else couldn't. I think I know, he said slowly, but I'm going to need help. The Reed Veterans Wilderness Center opened 18 months later on 200 acres of mountain land that Jacob purchased just 10 miles from where he'd made his discovery. The main lodge was built from local timber, designed to blend into the landscape while offering modern comfort. Smaller cabins dotted the property, each one private but connected by trails to the central gathering spaces. There were workshops for woodworking and metalwork, stables for horses, a shooting range, and miles of hiking trails that wound through some of the most beautiful country Colorado had to offer. But more important than the buildings or the land was the purpose. The center offered free month-long retreats for combat veterans struggling with PTSD, depression, and the difficulty of reintegrating into civilian life. No paperwork, no red tape, just an application and a willingness to show up. Veterans came from every branch of service, every era of conflict, every background imaginable. Some were young, fresh from Iraq or Afghanistan. Others were Vietnam vets in their 70s, still carrying wounds from 50 years ago. Jacob ran the center with the help of a small staff, but the real work was done by the veterans themselves. They chopped wood together, fixed fences, maintained trails, cared for horses. They learned traditional skills like blacksmithing and leatherwork. They sat around fires at night and told stories or said nothing at all, just existing together in the kind of silence that only other veterans could understand. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to heal. Maya had taken a leave of absence from the Forest Service to help establish the center. She developed the Wilderness Therapy Program, leading groups on multi-day backpacking trips where the challenge of the trail forced people out of their heads and into their bodies. She taught survival skills, navigation, campcraft. But more than that, she taught people that they were still capable, still strong, still valuable. I used to think I was running away from people, she told Jacob one evening as they sat on the lodge's wide porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. But really, I was running away from feeling helpless, from not being able to fix what was broken. Here, we're fixing things, not completely, not magically, but genuinely. Jacob nodded. My grandfather spent 40 years hiding. I spent 6. But you can't heal in isolation. Turns out you need other people, even when they're the last thing you think you want. The center's success exceeded even Jacob's optimistic projections. Word spread through veteran networks, online forums, Virginia hospitals. The waiting list grew to over a year. Jacob plowed every penny of profit back into expansion, adding more cabins, hiring more staff, developing new programs. He recruited other veterans to work there, giving them not just jobs, but purpose. One afternoon, about 2 years after the center opened, Jacob was working on a fence repair when a man approached him. He was in his 60s, weathered and lean, wearing a Marine Corps cap. You Jacob Reed? The man asked. Yes, sir. Name's Michael Torres. I'm here because... He paused, his jaw working. Because I heard you understand. About carrying things. About losing people. Jacob set down his hammer. I do. I lost my son in Afghanistan, 2011. He was 23. Michael's voice cracked. I've been trying to figure out how to keep living for 13 years now. Haven't found an answer yet. Jacob thought about Daniel, about the guilt that still woke him up some nights. I lost my brother, Afghanistan, 2009. He was 22. Michael's eyes met his, recognition and pain mirrored between them. Does it ever stop hurting? No, Jacob said honestly, but it changes. It becomes something you can carry instead of something that crushes you, and you learn you don't have to carry it alone. Michael stayed for 2 months. By the time he left, he wasn't fixed, but he was different. Lighter somehow. Before he departed, he found Jacob and said simply, "Thank you for building this place. Thank you for not giving up." Those words sustained Jacob through the hard days, through the inevitable struggles and setbacks that came with running a non-profit, because he saw the same transformation happen again and again. Veterans arrived broken and left whole, or at least more whole than when they'd come. And each time, Jacob felt a piece of his own brokenness heal in response. The media attention never fully went away, but it evolved. After the initial frenzy died down, journalists began writing deeper stories about the center, about the veterans it served, about the philosophy behind wilderness therapy for PTSD. National publications featured it. A documentary crew spent 3 months filming. Politicians visited, usually during election years, but Jacob didn't care about their motivations if it meant more funding and support for veteran services. Through it all, Maya was there. Their relationship had shifted from survival partners to colleagues to something deeper, though neither rushed to define it. They worked together, ate meals together, sat by fires together. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. It was easy and complicated all at once, the kind of connection that forms when two people have been through hell together and chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes. One evening, 3 years after the discovery, they hiked up to a ridge overlooking the center. Below, they could see lights coming on in the cabins as evening settled. Smoke rose from the lodge's chimney. Somewhere, someone was playing a guitar. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stumbled into my cabin that night?" Maya asked. Jacob smiled. "Probably would have frozen to death in that storm." "I'm serious." "So am I." He looked at her. "But yeah, I think about it. If the storm had hit a day later, if I'd taken a different trail, if you'd been stationed somewhere else, we never would have found the vault. Those treasures might still be buried. And this," he gestured to the center below, "none of this would exist." "Your grandfather," Maya said. "In his own broken way, he set all of this in motion. He made one terrible choice, but he spent 40 years trying to protect something valuable, and in the end, that protection led to all of this good." Jacob pulled out a worn photograph from his wallet. It was the one from the ranger station, his grandfather standing in front of the cabin in '86. He'd carried it ever since learning the truth. "I used to be so angry at him," Jacob said, "for leaving, for choosing isolation over family, but now I understand. He was doing what I was doing, what so many veterans do. He was trying to survive the only way he knew how. Was it the right way? No, but it was his way, and he left behind something that could help others, even if he didn't know it at the time." "You made peace with him," Maya observed. "I did. Finally." Jacob tucked the photo away. "And I think, wherever he is, he'd be proud of what we've built here. This center, helping veterans find their way back from the darkness, that's a better legacy than any treasure could be." The cabin where it all began had been preserved as a historical site. The Forest Service had decided to maintain it exactly as it was, complete with the vault below. It was open to the public on weekends, with guided tours that told the full story. The heist, the crash, Thomas Reed's decision, the 47 years of secret guardianship, the discovery, and the eventual return of the artifacts. Jacob visited it sometimes, standing in the small space where he'd nearly died from hypothermia, where he'd met Maya, where they'd opened the floor and found his grandfather's secret. Tour guides would point him out in whispers, the grandson who'd discovered it all. He never sought attention, but he didn't hide either. One tour guide, a retired ranger named Elizabeth, had known his grandfather. She pulled Jacob aside one day and said, "Thomas was a good man carrying a heavy burden. He used to sit right where you're standing and stare at that floor like he was trying to see through it. I never knew why until the news broke, but I knew he was suffering with something." "Did he ever seem happy?" Jacob asked. Elizabeth thought about it. Sometimes, when he was working, when he was out on the trails, he found peace in the doing, not in the being.
Maybe that's all any of us can hope for."
Jacob carried those words with him. The museums that received their artifacts back held special exhibitions, each one crediting Thomas Reed as the guardian who'd preserved them. The Denver Museum created a permanent display that included some of his journals, photographs of the vault, and a plaque that read, "Protected for 47 years by Thomas Reed, forest ranger and reluctant hero. These treasures survived because one man refused to let them be lost, even at great personal cost."
Jacob attended the opening with his father, Richard Reed. It was the first time they'd really talked about Thomas, about the grandfather Richard had lost and never understood. They stood in front of the display together, reading the journals Jacob had memorized.
"He never stopped loving us," Richard said quietly. "That's what hurts most. He loved us but couldn't figure out how to come home."
"No," Jacob agreed. "But maybe that's why this matters. Maybe we can't always fix our own lives, but we can leave behind something that helps others fix theirs."
Richard looked at his son. "You've done that. This center, what you've built, Daniel would be so proud." Jacob's eyes burned. "You think so?" "I know so. You took your pain and your brother's memory, and you created something that saves lives. That's the best kind of legacy there is."
On the 5-year anniversary of the discovery, the center held a celebration. Over 300 people attended, veterans who'd been through the program, staff members, volunteers, community members, reporters, and representatives from the museums. The governor came and gave a speech. Senator Elizabeth Warren sent a video message praising the work being done. But the moment that mattered most came late in the evening, after the official ceremonies ended. A young Marine, barely 25, stood up and asked to speak. His name was David, and he'd been at the center for 3 weeks. "I came here because I didn't see a point in being alive anymore," he said, his voice shaking. "I lost my whole team in Syria. I was the only one who made it out, and I couldn't understand why, couldn't figure out what the point was of surviving when everyone else died." The room had gone completely silent. But being here, working with my hands, talking to other veterans, hearing Jacob's story about his brother, I started to understand something. Maybe the point isn't to have all the answers. Maybe the point is just to keep going, to help where you can, to build something good from something broken. I'm not fixed. I don't know if I'll ever be fixed, but I'm not done. And that's something. Jacob stood and walked over to David. They embraced. 2 veterans who understood each other's pain in ways civilians never could. Around them, others stood as well, creating a chain of connection and understanding that spread through the entire room. Maya watched from the side, tears streaming down her face. This was why they'd built this place. Not for the recognition or the praise, but for moments like this. For watching broken people start to believe they could be whole again. Later that night, after everyone had gone and the center was quiet, Jacob and Maya walked together under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The mountains rose around them, dark and eternal, the same peaks that had witnessed his grandfather's secret, his own near death, their discovery, and everything that had followed. 5 years, Maya said. Sometimes it feels like 5 lifetimes. Everything changed that night, Jacob said. The storm, the cabin, finding you, finding the vault. My whole life pivoted on those few hours. Mine too. She took his hand, a gesture that had become natural over the years. I came to these mountains to hide from the world. Instead, I found a reason to engage with it again. We both did. They stood together in the darkness and the cold, 2 people who'd been lost and found their way home, not to a place but to a purpose. The treasures they'd discovered were back where they belonged, delighting scholars and museum visitors across the country. The story of Thomas Reed was being told honestly, with compassion for his complexity. And here in these mountains, broken veterans were finding hope. You know what I think? Maya said. I think sometimes we have to get completely lost before we can find what we're really looking for. Your grandfather got lost and found a way to protect beauty. You got lost in a storm and found your purpose. I got lost in grief and found peace. Jacob pulled her close.
And we found each other. And we found each other, she agreed. Above them, the stars wheeled slowly through the night sky, the same stars that had watched over humanity's triumphs and failures for millennia, the same stars that had shone down on Thomas Reed as he made his fateful decision, on Jacob and Maya as they opened that vault, on all the veterans who'd come here seeking salvation and found at least a measure of peace. The mountains held their secrets still, but this one had finally been shared. And in the sharing, in the telling, in the transformation of loss into purpose, something remarkable had happened. A broken family legacy had become a lifeline for thousands. $250 million in treasures had been returned to their rightful homes. And two people who'd thought they were beyond saving had discovered they could save others. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't gold or gems or priceless artifacts. Sometimes they're the connections we forge, the purpose we discover, the way we choose to transform our pain into someone else's healing. Jacob Reed had walked into those mountains 6 years ago trying to outrun his guilt and grief. He'd nearly died in a storm, stumbled into a cabin, and found a secret that changed everything. But the real discovery wasn't the treasure beneath the floor. It was the realization that even the most broken people can build something beautiful. That isolation isn't healing, connection is. That the legacy we leave isn't measured in money but in the lives we touch and the hope we create. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Jacob and Maya returned to the lodge. Inside, veterans were stirring, starting another day of healing work. Coffee was brewing. Someone was making breakfast. The rhythm of the center, the daily practice of moving forward despite pain, continued as it had for 5 years and would for decades to come. Jacob Reed had found his way home. Not to a place he'd left, but to a place he'd built from the ruins of his own broken dreams. And in building it, he'd discovered what his grandfather had tried and failed to find. Redemption, not through hiding, but through helping. Not through silence, but through story. Not through isolation, but through connection. The storm that nearly killed him had instead saved him. Sometimes that's how grace works. Sometimes you have to lose everything before you can find what matters most. Sometimes the path to healing runs straight through the heart of what hurt you, and sometimes, just sometimes, a dying man stumbles through a blizzard into exactly the place he needs to be, to discover exactly what the world needs him to find, so he can become exactly who he was always meant to be. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe broken things still deserve to shine.